And the shadow fell upon the land, and the world was riven stone from stone. The oceans fled, and the mountains were swallowed up, and the nations were scattered to the 8 corners of the world. All was shattered, and all but memory lost, and one memory above all others, of him who brought the shadow and the breaking of the world. A broken world, from the sharp peaks of the Dragon Wall to the smashing seas of Falm, the world of the Wheel of Time beckons to us. The maps draw us deeper, driving us across this land of echoes, magic, mystery. And yet, these maps have left our mouths dry, our questions unanswered, our desires unmet. How did these maps come to be, and whose hands wrought them? How did the world beneath these maps come to be? It is a long tale, a winding tale, and I invite you to come down the spiral steps here into the archives and grow in your wisdom of this world. Older and darker than ours, yet our world all the same. We must walk the broken lands, and these maps, such as they are, must be our guide. When you first cracked the spine of your first tome of the Wheel of Time, one of the very first things you saw was the map of this land. It had no name and was full of places and roads and cities you didn't know. You held the book thick in your hand and wondered where you might be going. To the Blight? Into the Sea of Storms? Would you climb Shai-o Ghul? During the long and epic tale, little did you know you would visit not only every place on this map, but more outside it. And so the map proved insufficient for you eventually. You went beyond it. Why did you never find another? Most of you are probably familiar with these maps of the Wheel of Time. You've seen them across the books or on the internet. But if you're a graybeard today, then just maybe when the first editions of the first book, Eye of the World, came out in 1990, you saw the original version of the maps. I never saw them until I scoured the archive with candle in hand. I had some help too from Jason over at Bookmarks with Jason. He has the first editions and helped me verify these early maps. The first maps are pretty primitive, but they do have a certain charm. We have the general world map in 2 versions, one much simpler and more computerized for the paperbacks, and one clearly hand-drawn for the hardcover. We also have one in the hand-drawn style for the starting area of the 2 rivers. Robert Jordan was obviously influenced deeply by J.R.R. Tolkien. He's the grandfather of the fantasy genre. The 2 Rivers itself is idyllic, Shire-esque, a clear reference to the old man's works. But Tolkien made his maps central. Jordan's maps, at least the first in the Wheel of Time, pale in comparison. They don't have the care, the artistic touch, or the attention to detail. While these maps aren't awful, they seem to have been made for a series that no one was sure was going anywhere. There is a Tolkien-like touch in the coastlines and the mountains, but otherwise it's all very basic. There are rivers that start and end without very clear elevation. All those rivers seem to be the same size, and it's pretty challenging to distinguish between the roads and the waterways. I also don't love the use of the computerized fonts. The hardcover ones look a little better for sure. They're neat in their own way, but we have to face it. They are lacking. I find the border around the sides more attractive than the map itself, especially in the color edition, and this edition really shows even more the remarkable lack of detail in the biomes and the different areas of the world. So why didn't the maker, Jordan, and his artists spend more time on the maps from the start? Did he even care about the map at all? Well, it certainly wasn't first priority for him, like it was for Tolkien. There's a story that Jordan's publisher, Tom Doherty, asked Jordan for a map of the world of the Wheel of Time for the first few books. Jordan was taken by surprise at the idea and dashed one off and sent it along with his drafts. It was refined a little by John Ford, and that gave us the first maps in those early editions. Let's take a moment and look at it more closely. The geography is strange. Jordan might not have taken Tolkien's attention to mapping to heart, but he did use the whole idea of 90-degree mountain ranges, something that has been rumored to cause the death of numerous pedantic geologists. Also, the center of this main landmass is supposed to be lush and wet, but with all the mountains around blocking the precipitation, it's pretty unlikely that that would have been the case. There's not even a name to this whole area of the world at all. So we, the readers and travelers of this world, took to calling it Randland. It was only many years later that an official role-playing game finally named it, calling it the Westlands. So, did Jordan just mash together some fantasy slop and shoot off a map, not caring what it looked like or if it made sense? Well, how dare you think of the maker that way? I want to look at this again. Sure, there are weird mountains, but what's not simple on this map? Remember that every map tells a story. Look at the number of places, nations, routes, and rivers. All these things talk of the depth of history and place in this world. This map isn't telling us about geography. It's telling us about the inhabited places of the world. The fact that Jordan could just dash off a map, so complex and relational as this, shows that he knew his world intimately. He knew which nations bordered which, what part of the world they were in, what kind of climate and landscape they had, and how they were navigated. We know that geography is very important in the Wheel of Time, from how the Dragon Wall blocks rain and therefore creates the cultural world of the Aiel, to the archipelagos that dominate the culture of the Sea World, to the warriors that live on the edge of the mountainous and dangerous Blight. In Jordan's land, geography and culture are totally interwoven. As a history buff, Jordan was sensitive to the ways that land informs peoples and how those things relate to each other. So this first map reflects the fact that he'd already worked out all these cultures in depth. After all, we won't actually visit many of these places until much later books, but he still had them on there. Unlike Tolkien, who started with a map, Jordan approached his story from a historical and cultural standpoint first. His concept was that the world was woven from many different elements and historical events and myths and geology. How it looked from outer space wasn't so important. Let's go a little deeper into that idea. Remember that Jordan was writing a post-apocalyptic story. Randland is our world, tens or hundreds of thousands of years into the future. Because of that, the world is embedded with all kinds of hints that tell the myths that have shaped humankind thus far. Our world is in this story. We find analogues to England in Andor, France in Karheen, Spain in Amadicia, Japan in Shinar, Egypt in Tyr, and many more. And they aren't one-to-one. They're mixed and mashed. The Aiel Waste draws inspiration from the deserts of the Middle East and the tribes of Israel, while Shanshin incorporates elements of imperial China and feudal Japan. Jordan has been called the American Tolkien, not necessarily because The Wheel of Time was as influential or great as Lord of the Rings, but because where Tolkien took Northern European myths and legends and reworked them in his world, Jordan took from the great melting pot of global and American culture and boiled it all together. On this map, that cultural diversity manifests in the variety of place names. Tar Valon echoes Avalon from Arthurian legend. Shaiol Ghul references the Hebrew Sheol. Tarmon Gaidon is a clear nod to Armageddon. But it's also more personal than just great human legends. Jordan drew a great deal from his own life. He served 2 tours in Vietnam as a helicopter gunner. He was a killer. The Iceman, they called him. Dragon Mount isn't just a place where Rand must face himself. It's somewhere outside Saigon where Jordan had to kill that cold young man and leave him dead, so that he could really come home again. Death is light as a feather, duty heavier than a mountain. When we read The Wheel of Time, sometimes things get very dark. It gets personal. And that's why this video started with a narrative of the breaking. The breaking is the pivotal historical event in The Wheel of Time. It shapes everything. The geography, first of all. Mountains rose and fell, continents cracked, the oceans were drained and remade. Everything on the planet changed. We can be cynical and say that the breaking is just a convenient way to explain things like straight-edged mountains. But shall we always approach the world this way with bitterness in our hearts? The reality is that the breaking is more a psychological event than a geological one. For Jordan, the world being so scarred and broken and strange is a reflection of the way the world is woven. Landscapes, like people, like himself, bear the scars of past trauma. The world of the Wheel of Time, being broken, makes the world a character itself. In truth, the Wheel of Time was never meant to be a fantasy. Jordan originally wrote it all much, much darker. In his earliest drafts, the story was visceral, sexual, and grim. It was a post-apocalyptic, alien-infested world with half-human demons. But to reach a bigger audience, he dialed back that world into the fantasy one we now know. But that darkness lingers. In traveling the world, we must face the corruption and struggle. We must be reborn, like the characters we travel with. So I think when we look at all this, from the worldwide cultural inspirations to the personal transformations, to the darkness of corruption and trauma and rebirth, we can see that Jordan was very different than Tolkien in how his world came to be. Tolkien was an explorer. Jordan was a historian. Where Tolkien famously said that he started with a map and made the story fit, I think we can say that Jordan started with a story and made the map fit. Now that we've shaped the continents and broken the world, let us go back to the maps. Hold the candle higher, would you? There are many, many maps to see, and you must learn how they have changed and how they've never quite been finished. In Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's maps are finished. There's no question. The map we get in modern versions is just a simplified one of Tolkien's original. But in the history of the Wheel of Time, the maps have never stopped being made and remade. I've already shown you the 1990 original publication maps, drawn by John Ford based on sketches and notes from Jordan. We clamored for more, and in 1994, Tor Books had Ellisa Mitchell completely redraw the maps. This was, to say the least, a good idea. Mitchell is actually first credited earlier, in 1992, as Elisa Martin. It's not clear how she was involved before. The history is murky. What part of the maps were by John Ford, or Tom Canty, or Elisa Martin? I searched the scrolls but found little detail. But what is clear is that from 1994 onward, once Ellisa designed these new maps, first the black and white edition and then the hand-painted version of the same, they were instantly loved. They've been included in every subsequently printed version. These were the only maps I knew because I only started reading in the mid-90s. These maps, look at them. They're on a different level. Obviously done in a much more artistic eye by a dedicated artist who is well versed in Tolkien-style maps and atmosphere. There are forests, the mountains are prettier, the coastlines echo Tolkien's. We can easily tell apart roads and rivers by the dotted and solid lines. The labels are standardized in size and style. In Mitchell's maps, we also see some little fixes to the geography, such as connecting rivers that previously went nowhere. And we get banners announcing the map and a compass extremely appropriate to the symbology of the books. These maps are a total game changer. The painted color version is even more awesome. It's a completely different world. We get forests, biomes, and such a stronger sense of place and geography compared to the earlier color maps. I particularly love how the mountains were done, not in a peak way like we always see, but as steps and hills. It reduces the sharp feeling of the 90-degree angle geography and makes everything feel much more real. But Mitchell didn't invent anything revolutionary here. She essentially cleaned up the maps and added a Tolkien style along with her own flair to make the world come alive. But look at these. Bring the candle closer. Look at these local maps. Excuse me while I simp a little for Mitchell here. These local maps are amazing. I've never really seen maps like these in any other fantasy work. Maps that appear every time we enter a new city or new major area. They're each unique, beautiful, remarkable. Each of them is a poster. There are rural maps, city maps. Constantly through the chapters, we keep referring back to these maps to orient ourselves in the story. And through them, the tale comes alive. You can see yourself walking those streets, picking specific buildings as the key places, knowing the footsteps of the characters. There are fortresses, countrysides, forests, side views, icons. Fantasy tends to focus heavily on big world maps, but these local maps brought places to life with a degree of specificity and detail that added enormously to Jordan's storytelling. These local maps were also drawn ongoing for the rest of the series, so you can see the style shift between them. For me, these city maps are the highlight of all the Wheel of Time maps. Here's just a few more to drool over before I move on. So, there we are. Basically, these are all the Wheel of Time maps we know from the series, but there's a problem, you say? What's that? Oh yes, there's an awful lot of the story that happens beyond the world map. The Aiel Waste, Seanchan, and we just never see those. You flip back while reading and try to figure out where you are in those later books, and all you can do is say, well, we're somewhere off the side. And now the true world maps come in. In 1997, Jordan collaborated with John Ford, the original map illustrator, and Tom Canty on The World of the Wheel of Time. This book is sometimes called the Big White Book by fans, but it actually has a more common and much more unfortunate nickname as well, the big book of bad art. And it's in this one that we get the first world map, by John Ford, supposedly made in 1995, although the big book came out in 1997. I don't know why they didn't involve Queen Mitchell here, but they didn't. It shows. Ford sort of misunderstood the measurements that Jordan gave, but that wasn't really his fault, because Jordan was always vague about the map's instructions. He explained a few things. The world's circumference is the same as our own, since it's our world. Seanchan is 11,000 miles from Falm and 3,000 miles from Shara. It's also around 6,000 miles wide at its widest point, and wider below the equator than above. He said basically it's our world with all the tectonic plates shifted. So Ford tried, and geographically, well, in Seanchan, rivers drain in multiple directions and break not only geological laws, but maybe physical laws too. We could wave it away by the idea of Seanchan being an engineering project by the power users, but it's not great. Jordan did try to correct a few things on this map, particularly the exact size and layout of Seanchan, but that never made it in, so this is what we got. It left us all with some pretty big questions. One that really needled everyone was why people would sail from Seanchan to the Westlands across the Erith Ocean when it's a much shorter jaunt to Shara. This inspired a ton of discussion about sailing, currents, wind patterns, Sharan history, and the difference between Randland miles and our miles. In the world of the Wheel of Time, after all, it is stated that reliable sources are limited. All documents from before the War of the 100 Years survive only as copies, or copies of copies, etc., and thus may well include mistakes made by the scribes. So we made maps, reams of maps. We made climate maps, we made journey maps, we made video game versions and timeline versions. And therein is the power of Jordan's world. Rather than having an iffy map turn everyone off, it turned everyone on. Everyone wanted to work out the details and figure out the bad spots. Jordan's world is about the story first, and the maps come after. And somehow we all feel invited to participate in this world, to add to the archives. Case in point, Michael Livingston. A longtime fan, Livingston wove fantasy and world building into his own life as a professor and writer, and he tasked himself with investigating Randland. He dove through Jordan's notes long after the series was finished and collaborated with the estate to write The Origins of the Wheel of Time, which came out in 2022. This book goes through the deep mythological origins in the series, and it introduces a new and revised world map, this time with Her Greatness herself, My Lady Mitchell, involved again. This world map, the most recent we have, again from 2022, fits the style of the books. And maybe it's more accurate to Jordan's vision, it's very hard to say. Livingston changed a few labels and changed Seanchan, and it's controversial. At least it looks better. So with that, my friend, we're just about ready to leave the archives. Come now up the spiral stairs towards the light. Leave the maps behind for the next ones who come, for those who will come with more turnings of the wheel. We can admit one thing. The maps of this world weren't as important to Jordan in the way they were to Tolkien. The maker didn't endlessly revise and rework them to get them right. They don't fit the full journeys of the characters across the books. He sent some notes, some revisions, but mostly let the artists struggle through it. The broken world has geographies that will bother geographers, and there are questions that remain about how the world works. But may I never know shade if I don't tell the story fully. The truth is that Jordan didn't just create his fantasy world from a map. He pulled it out of himself and out of human history around the world. It is an emotional tale, a meaningful myth, a fable, a history. He left us all hints and clues, and as a result, we all feel involved. No one reads a fantasy book because it has a good map. We read it because it has a good story. And so Jordan wrote a good story. His influence on us remains, not in his maps, but the darkness and romance and multiculturalism he brought to fantasy have been influential. And though he died before he could even finish the books, we've carried on his story. Whether that's Brandon Sanderson poring over notes and writing in his place, or Michael Livingston studying maps, or Ellisa Mitchell imagining the landscapes across the Westlands, or whether it's all of us walking the world of the Wheel of Time. And what he teaches us is that a map doesn't have to come first for a world to be deep, rich, gripping, and to pull millions of people in. Maps change over time just as they do of our own world on the Earth, and we'll always have more questions. Because the Wheel of Time turns, and maps come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the world that gave it birth comes again. So let's enjoy the turning, and the weaving, and the building, and all find ourselves in this distant land that is somehow still so close to us. May you always find water and shade. Thanks for watching.